There's a lot of conversations around leadership strategy and the important role that leadership plays at a time when markets are becoming more complex and staff retention is more challenging. We've seen a rash of new theories, approaches, and tactics that look at how we can build better leaders. Yet oftentimes we fail to look at what gets in the way of people becoming effective leaders. And how can we support people in our organizations to achieve their leadership potential? I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for taking the time to join me here on A Seat at the Table, where we talk to leading executives, entrepreneurs, and innovators who share their insights, experience, and outlook on business, technology, and leadership. It's wonderful to have you as part of our international community that now spans over 100 countries. Today I'm speaking with Jack McGuinness, an executive team coach and co-founder of Relationship Impact, a consulting firm focused on helping organizations build great leadership teams. Jack served with the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division, was COO of a boutique management consulting firm, and CEO of a contract packaging company. He also served as an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business. In this podcast, Jack talks about where leadership teams go wrong, what is needed in leaders in order to help companies and teams navigate these complex times, and what he learned about leadership during his career in the military that's applicable to industry. Before we get started, if you are a supply chain executive who'd like to finally put an end to information overload and get a concise, fact-based summary of key market developments and shifts, as well as sharp insights into what's likely to impact sourcing in the coming months, then the current situation in sourcing is what you're looking for. To learn more, head over to thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net, where you can get all of the details. And you can find the links in the show notes as well. Now let's sit down with Jack and find out how we can get our leadership teams flying in formation. I'm really happy to have you on A Seat at the Table, Jack, because right now leadership, it's not that leadership has ever been unimportant, but I think that when you're facing very disruptive times, very complex, very fast-changing times, leadership really plays a more key role in being able to keep the ship afloat and also hopefully navigate it into a bit calmer and more prosperous waters.
Right.
So I think that it's interesting to get your point of view. And I think, you're coming from a little bit different background than some of the other people that we've had on the show talking about leadership. So I'm really quite excited to be able to dive in and get your point of view.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
So, when different times call for different types of leaders, what do you think is needed in leaders in order to help companies and teams navigate these particular times?
Well, I think, I couldn't agree with your point more. It's our hammer, and it's what we use, right?
Right.
The work that we do. So I do believe that leaders are critical. And I think even more importantly is a cohesive leadership team is absolutely critical to the health and the productivity of an organization in any time, but particularly when times are tough. And we saw that firsthand with some of our clients during the initial stages of the pandemic. Those that were really sort of had, there's no perfect team, of course, but
right.
Those that had some strong cohesion to them sort of weathered the storms a little bit more productively and with a little less tension than some of the other ones. So
yeah,
I couldn't agree anymore.
Absolutely. So when you look at what we're particularly facing now, we're in, we seem to be heading out of the pandemic, but Now we're facing rising interest rates, inflationary pressures, geopolitical tensions.
Yeah.
So we sort of put one tough scenario behind us, and now we're heading into something that could be equally as challenging. What do you think, from your experience, what do you think is the right kind? Because there's different kinds of leadership for different times, right? Different leadership skill sets that are more applicable depending upon the situation. Mm-hmm. What do you think are some of the critical factors that's needed right now? If you're picking a leadership team, or if you're looking to develop a leadership team, what are you looking for? What specific attributes or characteristics? Experience?
Yeah, so there's a few things. Like we talk to the CEOs that are typically the ones that hire us. Don't just assume that bringing a talented group of experienced individuals together that have done a great job functionally or, have great technical expertise are going to necessarily be the right members for your executive team or have the right profile. Not that they can't develop the capabilities, but there's a few capabilities that are really, really critical from our perspective. The first is having an ability to think beyond today, think beyond the problems we're facing today. You can be a great firefighter, a great problem solver, but you really have to help your leadership team that you're on and the team that you lead have some sense of foresight about what is emerging, what and how will that impact our organization? And a lot of leaders have those capabilities, but some are very focused on foresight as it relates to their function or their technical, area that they oversee. And, so that leads me into the second characteristic of the ability to have a greater good focus or an ability to not just focus on what's good for my functional unit, but good for the organization. And that's hard. That's a hard step for a lot of functional leaders to make. I know it wasn't easy for me when I had to do it. And so those things are very closely aligned. Like, having foresight for my unit is one thing, but having foresight for the good of the organization is really, really an important skill. And I think third, and often talked about, but not necessarily a capability of all great leaders, is the ability to manage complexity. In today's times, particularly, but really in any time, as you grow in an organization, the complexity increases.
Right.
And that can be even a small organization, but particularly in larger organizations, the ability to simplify complicated issues that are changing day to day for yourself, for your leadership team, and for the rest, and the team you lead, and the rest of the organization is really, really critical attributes for good leadership team members. And I think the last thing is another one that often goes, it's paid lip service to, but modeling the behaviors that you expect of the rest of the organization, the values that you've espoused. If leadership teams don't do that, it's very, very unlikely that they'll be cascaded well throughout the rest of an organization. So those are, four characteristics that we believe are really important for leadership team members to have, or at least have expectations set around them to develop.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
I think those are really important points, and I'm very glad you brought them up, because each one individually really stands on its own as something that's critical. And, the fourth point you brought up really shines very brightly, particularly in this particular time when we really do see, sadly, a lot of people who I can't even say they're leaders. You could just say they're people in power, whether they be politically, not naming names, or corporate, not naming names, who seem to live in a world where, rules for thee, but not for me. And I think you're right. You really can't expect to have any kind of buy-in, any type of compliance, if you are not, as you said, walking the talk, so to speak.
Right. Unless you live in an autocratic world, and most organizations, even if they are set up like that, in today's world, it's hard to run an organization like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, to your point about understanding the big picture, understanding not just your particular silo, so to speak, but the greater good of the company. How can companies sort of enable leaders of individual units or departments or divisions or whatever you wish to break them down as, how can they help some of those people get that bigger picture? Because sometimes what you may perceive from your vantage point as the greater good might actually appear differently if you were viewing it from a different perspective.
Yeah, great question. And I think the answer is to take time to talk about what each one of those characteristics looks like, but what does it look like for now as a leadership team member to espouse a greater good focus versus a what's good for my organization. And what really I think needs to happen, and in a lot of teams, leadership teams, it doesn't, is the ability for team members to have tough conversations about the most important stuff that they're facing. Because if they do, then the discussions about what's good, what's best for the organization rise to the top. They just emerge, and so it will be much easier for me as the head of sales to say, hey, look, it looks like we're having some operational challenges right now, and so I'm willing to sacrifice some resources, for example, for us to shore up those operational challenges. And so if you're talking about what's most important, and those things are prevalent in the face of the leadership team, week to week, day to day, then it's much more likely that folks will know what is for the good of the organization. Doesn't mean they will adapt, right?
Right.
So there's another relational characteristic that I think is really important, is that having teams move towards holding each other accountable in a supportive, constructive way, without just the power in the room, without just the CEO, without just the president being in place. And again, that takes the ability to have tough conversations as well. But, if someone falls down, then the ability to say, hey, look, I get where you're coming from. I know why that's important, but can you understand why this is most important for the best interest of the organization? Those conversations are easily said, right, but they're not had most of the time. And that's really what we find, is that skill of having tough conversations about what's most important is really, really, really a challenge for a lot of leadership teams.
I can understand why that would be. I mean, certainly everyone sort of wants to protect their own turf. Historically, not in every organization, of course, but there is a general sense of things when you join an organization that, of course, senior management only wants to hear good news. I don't know if I'm framing that very well, but I mean, you get what I mean. So,
I do.
So you feel compelled to not bring problems to the table, which of course ultimately can be a problem in and of itself.
Catastrophic. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's difficult because of course, when you run something, you do want to hear that things are good. You have enough other problems, and you tend to, maybe you just can't help it, but you do favor those people who keep coming to you with the good news, and the guy who keeps coming with the problems is someone who you wish to avoid. So it is tough to be able to create that environment and being able to sort of take it on the chin in the short run, right? In order
I also think, so I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I also think that, adults don't really like to confront each other.
Right.
And they consider it conflict. Disagreement is often very uncomfortable for folks.
Right.
And I think the mishmash of all those things that you mentioned, plus the fact that adults don't like to confront each other, makes having those kind of tough conversations really important, really difficult and challenging. But as you know, that's, if an extreme example, you read the paper every day and you look at what's happening in Ukraine, and you look at the leadership style of Putin, and I mean, he's a classic example. He wants all the good news, and he's sort of suffering the consequences a little bit of it now, and that's obviously an extreme example, but that behavior I see, as you said, I see quite a bit of. It's like, I want to hear the good stuff, not the bad stuff, and that's a recipe for eventually a challenge.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right about, pointing out that essentially people want to avoid conflict. I mean, we're brought up that we need to be cooperative, that we need to have a team spirit. So much of that has been embedded, and we seem to feel that we're almost detracting from that team spirit by bringing up something negative, that we're
That's right.
And even though you're not being confrontational for the sake of being confrontational, you're just trying to put forward a problem that needs to be dealt with. But you're right. Nobody wants to be that guy.
Yeah, and the best teams that we work with. So our aspiration for every team that we work with is that they move towards a place where people can hold each other accountable. Right. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean, in a very supportive way. People say, "Hey, look, it seems like you're struggling right now," or you said you were going to get this done several times and it's not done. Let's step back and what can we do to help you and to prevent a storm from happening, or just the ability to provide each other with feedback in a constructive, delivering it well and receiving well is very, very difficult.
Oh, absolutely. Where do you typically see leadership teams go wrong? I mean, in your opinion, where typically, and I'm sure every company is different, but in general, where does the train jump the tracks?
Yeah. So I'd say there's two things, right? The first thing is, I mentioned it earlier, that and it's a natural instinct, but a CEO or a president assumes that his or her direct reports have what it takes to be a great leadership team member. They got promoted to the head of sales or the new CFO, and they may be great technically, but they don't necessarily know what it takes to be a great leadership team member. And that's what gets teams off the tracks right out of the starting gate. The second thing that's very closely related to that is that the teams don't step back and say, how are we going to operate this team for this organization at this point in our journey? Because context matters, and teams have different composition. This composition changes. That means the team changes. Right. The strategy may change, and the focus or the purpose of the team has to change with that. So making sure you take a step back and set up the structural dynamics, like how are we going to operate? What are our expectations for each other? What does it look like when we're integrating well across our functional areas? How are we going to meet on the strategic versus the tactical? And then stepping back and saying, do we have a sense of trust on this team? Do people trust each other's capabilities and character? Are they able to have those tough conversations? And are they likely to be able to hold each other accountable? Because those two things, the structural and the relational side, are inextricably linked. And if you have bad structure, it can lead to some relational problems right away. Those are the two things I would say is like stepping back and really setting expectations of what it means to be a good leadership team member.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We oftentimes don't think about that because you just dive in right away to try to tackle. If there's problems, get on top of those problems. If there's goals, let's get ahead of those goals.
That's right.
But you're not really thinking about that. It almost seems like, no time to do that. Yeah.
No question.
Yeah, absolutely. So if someone comes in a leadership position and things are not in good shape, what would you suggest? And again, everything is different, but in general, what could they do initially to try to right what's gone wrong as quickly as possible?
I think the CEO or the formal team leader, the president, that really, if there is they're getting off the tracks a little bit. It really is incumbent upon the CEO to say, hey, what's getting in the way here? What is it? And so what it really takes on the part of the formal leader is to be able to say, I have to hear things right now that I may not want to hear. Right. I may be part of the problem. I may be doing stuff that's getting in the way, probably unintentionally, but I need to get my mindset straight on that, because the next series of questions I'm going to ask the team, I have to be willing to listen to what they have to say. So it's, how are we doing as a team? Are we set up? Are we dealing with the right problems? Or are we dealing with trivial problems? Are we structured the right way in terms of, do people have the right mindset to be great executive team members? Do we meet well? Just basic blocking and tackling things.
Right.
And then the hard questions are around, do we really trust each other? Are we having the hard conversations? And can we hold each other accountable without just me in the room? And so really important for the formal leader to have some self-awareness, have some vulnerability, be able to listen, because asking those questions, the first time you ask the question and you shut down the dialogue because you didn't like what you heard, someone said, hey, look, you're dominating the conversations, or you're getting in people's way because you're pitting people against each other unintentionally. And the first time you act defensive about that or get annoyed about that, then the conversation gets shut down, and you might as well not even have asked the question.
That's such a good point that you bring up, because that's exactly the way it has typically been in most organizations. And some of that, I suppose, is because senior leadership has been brought up to believe that they needed to be infallible. So
that's
therefore,
right.
Trying to be vulnerable is the opposite of being
right.
infallible. So it is very tough for people who have been brought up with that particular either mindset or been trained in that leadership style.
Well, certainly my generation has been brought up, and the generation before that. I think the younger generations are probably getting a little bit better at that. But, we thought we had to know. And you get to a senior role and you can't know everything. And it's not really your job to know everything. It's too much information. We got, a phone that's a crazy, massive computer. And, so there's too much stuff coming at us from different directions. So, but that is still the mantra I see, for sure.
Yeah, it is. And it's tough. It's tough to be able to sit down with people and hear critique of yourself. And at the same time, it's tough for people on the team to have the guts to speak up and say, actually, you're putting us in a situation where,
that's right.
Very few people are going to do that.
Unless the leader creates the conditions where that's okay. And that's hard.
Absolutely.
And you said, you asked me a question before about how does it get off the tracks. I guess I'd put that as the third one.
Right.
A leader's ability to be self-aware enough to recognize that they are clearly part of the team dynamic, and maybe they're doing something that's getting away. And it's oftentimes not intentional. And there's obviously a lot of other dynamics at play, but you have to recognize that you're part of the success and part of the challenge. Yes.
I think that's true. I think that you're not just part of one or the other. So
right.
It's easy to theorize about it, but when you have to sit down and actually, roll it out in a live situation with your team sitting there around the conference table, it could be daunting. For sure.
I refer this book to everyone that I hope you don't mind me bringing it up, but it's a great book by Tasha Eurich. Do you know her?
I don't know offhand, actually.
Yeah,
Please
she's an organizational psychologist, and she wrote a book called Insight. And I sent the Harvard Business Review article she wrote before the book that talks about self-awareness in a very layman's practical terms. Basically, there's two sides of self-awareness. There's one, how we see ourselves and reflecting on, how we see ourselves show up. What are we motivated by? But almost most importantly, she doesn't really put it like this, but I kind of do, is the other side of self-awareness is trying to figure out how others in your environment see you. Without that, you can't be self-aware. Right. I think she said 70% of people think they're self-aware, but they're not.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are interesting points, because you're right. It really, it's a whole different way of thinking. And I think that most people who rise up to the top in leadership have done so because they've been goal-oriented and they've been able to achieve those goals. So that's given them the success that's propelled them upwards. And as they move to higher and higher levels, they need to develop other skills that maybe, weren't cultivated along the way.
That's right.
As well as be able to show a bit more self-awareness. So it's tough. It's easy, right, to say what people should be doing and not as easy when
it's easy to be. I say that to my clients all the time. It's easy for me to give you advice. I know what I'm asking you to do is hard. I know it sounds easy, but I know it's hard.
Absolutely. Now, you had said that you began your career actually in the military.
I did, yes.
Yeah. So, there's a tremendous amount of leadership training that goes on as being part of military. It's obviously a very big and very well-structured, very well-functioning organization. What do you feel you've learned from your experience there that you feel is most applicable to industry?
Well, I had the fortunate experience to be an infantry platoon leader with the 10th Mountain Division. So that's small unit tactics, right? And so what I learned right out of the starting gate is that the essence of team. I was the leader, the formal leader that had I planned the training. I wrote the operations orders with my management team, my sergeants. But in an infantry unit, everyone depends on everyone else.
Right.
And so there is a plan, but it never comes to fruition. So the ability to practice and to, like I said before, stepping back and talking about how we are going to operate as a team is absolutely critical and ingrained as a young officer in the Army for sure. And so I think training, stepping back, talking about how we are going to operate as a team is an absolute critical element that I learned in the military. I think the other thing is humility is a big thing because things change so much in the military and particularly in an infantry unit that you have to be adaptable, resilient. So I think those are a couple things for sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that sometimes we overlook some of those critical skills that you do learn in military, particularly when people are training to potentially be in God bless you, in an active duty situation where you really do need each other. You can't afford to stand on ceremony. And, an ego can be a matter of life and death. And we forget about the vast amount of learning that comes from that could be applied in any other situation, particularly in industry.
There's no question. Yeah, I could go on and on about that. Like team. I think particularly in any combat arms related, anyone that's on the front line type of operation, I think the ability to have to rely on each other and have to have practiced and talked about what we're going to do when X, Y, or Z happens and what happens if it doesn't. And those are, and I try to apply those same principles to the client work that I do in terms of that step back. Like, if we don't talk about how we're going to operate as a team and how we integrate across functional units, for example, and where the gray areas are between my responsibilities as a leader and your responsibilities as a leader, we're going to get ourselves in trouble at some point.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really an interesting way to look at it, because while people tend to say this is the goal and we talk about how we're going to get to the goal, but there's not a lot of attention paid to, well, what if this doesn't happen? Then what do we do? We're not really looking at all those scenarios. And maybe, I suppose, the difference between being in a frontline situation during a conflict and being in industry is perhaps a little bit different from the point of view that your life isn't on the line. But we could gain a lot by
same principles, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting to look at it that way.
Absolutely, yes.
And have all those plans in place.
No question. Yeah, no question.
So how do you benchmark success or at least progress for leadership? Because I think that's a difficult thing.
It is.
And we live in a world where we do want to understand success. We're driven by metrics and by benchmarks. But how do you do that for leadership?
Yeah, I mean, we call it like, how do you know you're even moving the needle a little bit, right?
Right.
And so what we do is beginning. We use the third party assessment for all of the team, the leadership teams we work with, that measures 7 structural elements and 7 relational elements. I talked before about, relational element is like trust. Can you have a tough conversation with each other? Structural element is the people know what their roles are. So we use that as a benchmark to begin with. And we also use it as a start off point so that folks, it's an easy way for folks they evaluate themselves. We usually have their direct reports also contribute to this evaluation. So they have a view of how they see themselves, how their direct reports see them. And they start making some sense of what is it that's getting in our way? And we use that as a starting off point for beginning the work that we do as consultants with them. And then we use it 6 months later and sometimes 12 months later as a vehicle to see if they've made some progress or not. So it's an objective way of measuring a fairly subjective science.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it, because you're right. It is very subjective.
Yeah.
And it's tough to measure. And oftentimes the time it takes to actually see what you might call tangible results is longer than what most people would like. So Absolutely. They need a little encouragement.
It's most of the work that we do is adult behavior change. So
right.
And moving the needle on that is, and so our engagements, we don't do anything for less than 4 months, and most of our engagements are over a year.
Right.
So it's very much a coaching, developmental, hands-on approach that we deploy.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Jack, you've shared so many interesting things. I think people would love to be able to reach out to you.
Sure.
How can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Well, I just wrote a book.
Oh, great.
So it's right in front of me. It's getting published on Amazon, released on Amazon on June 14th. So
excellent. Congrats.
Learn a lot about that there. But there's also a companion website. It's called greatleadershipbook.com.
Okay.
And my website is relationship-impact.com. But I would go to greatleadershipbook.com because that will give you some pretty practical insights into how to build a great leadership team. And of course, my email is jmcguinness@relationship-impact.com.
Well, I'm going to make sure all of those links are in the show notes. They'll also be over on our podcast website at seatpodcast.com, so people will be able to find them. I know it's a bit difficult when you're listening to a podcast. You might be driving or something, and you don't have the opportunity to write it down. So just by going to either one of those places, you'll be able to find the podcast and find all of these links. So I think really you've shared so many outstanding insights. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Jane. I really appreciate the time. It was great talking to you.
Thank you for tuning in to A Seat at the Table. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something from it, I'd love to hear about it. Your feedback powers this show. If you'd like to support the show, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Also, share episodes you found valuable on LinkedIn or other social media and call out your biggest insight or takeaway from the program. And don't forget to tag me, Jane Singer. I love seeing which episodes you liked best. And if you have time, please leave a review on any of the major podcast channels. Also, don't forget to check out our website, seatpodcast.com. That's SEAT podcast.com. You'll find all kinds of bonus content there, including free ebooks, discounts on apps and other products, as well as a preview of upcoming podcast episodes. You can also send a message with any thoughts, feedback, or suggestions there, and yes, I will read them. Thank you for joining me today and supporting the show. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in our next episode of A Seat at the Table.